All right, so far we have only looked at the built-in validators. In this lecture, I'm going to show you how to implement a custom validator function. So first on Angular website, let's search for validator fn, validator function. Note that here validator function is actually an interface, as it's indicated by this I in this green box. So let's have a look. You can see this interface is defined in Angular/forms. And here is the structure of this interface. So this interface represents functions with this signature. A function that takes abstract control as a parameter and returns validation errors or null. So in the section about TypeScript, you learned that we use interfaces to define a shape for our objects. We can use interfaces to define the shape of functions as well. So any function that matches this signature is considered a validator function. By signature, I mean the type and order of parameters as well as the return type. Now we can define this function anywhere in our application, but it's better to put all the validator functions inside a class. This way we encapsulate them in a single place. So back in VS Code, in our signup form folder, I'm going to add a new file. Call it username.validators.ts. Here I'm going to export a class called username validators because we can have more than one validator function. Now here's one example. Let's say we want to set a rule so the username cannot contain a space. So here I add a method cannot contain space. Now as you saw in the declaration of the validator fn interface, this method or this function should take a parameter of type abstract control. So control of type abstract control. And you can see this class is defined in Angular/forms. Now this method should return either validation errors or null. Now let's import this type here. Okay, so now we have a validator function. Let's implement a simple rule here. If control.value, now look at the type of this property. It's any. I want to treat this as a string. So we add as string here. And then one more parenthesis here. So if control.value as string.index of white space is not -1, or you can write it as is greater than or equal to 0, which basically means if we have a space in the username, now we should return validation errors. Once again, back on the Angular website, this time let's search for validation errors. So this validation errors represents an object that has one or more key value pairs. Keys are a string and values can be anything. So here we should return an object. The key of this object is the name of the validation error. In this case, cannot contain space. Or as another example, if we were going to implement that built-in required validator, the key here would be required. Okay? So cannot contain space. Now the value can be anything. If you want to supply some details to the user, you can add an object here. Otherwise, you can add true. Now, as another example, if we were going to build that built-in min-length validator, our object here, our validation error object would be like this. Min-length, and the value instead of true would be an object with two properties. Required length, which would be some number, and actual length would be control.value.length, something like that. So if you want to provide details to the client, you use a complex object as a value here. Now let's undo this. In case of this validation error, cannot contain space, we don't want to return any details, so a simple boolean true is enough. So if the validation fails, we return a validation errors object. Otherwise, we return null. Okay? Now, one last step. In order to access this method from the outside, without having to create an instance of this username validators class, we decorate this method with static. And then from the outside, we can simply type username validators dot cannot contain space. Okay? So this is what we call a static method. Delete. So here we have a custom validator. Now we need to import this into our component. So let's go to sign up form component. Here's our username form control object. In this array, in the array of validators, I can add our custom validator. So username validators dot cannot contain space. Now, before going any further, I just want to emphasize that in this particular demo, I put this custom validator inside the sign up form folder because this is the only place we're using this validator. In a large complex application, chances are you might have different components that use the same validator. If that's the case, you need to put all these validators in a common place. For example, here inside the app folder, I have added this folder, common, and inside common, we have validators. So we can add all the common validators that different components need inside this folder, okay? So we have added our custom validator here. Now finally, let's go to our template. Now I'm gonna duplicate this line here. Change the expression for ngIf to username.errors.cannot contain space. That's the key we set in our object earlier, okay? And the error, we should change this to username cannot contain space. Let's try this. So back in the browser, I type mosh space Hamedani tab, and here's our custom validation error.